think of all the things that have been written about me. That I am an inhuman female demon. That I am an innocent victim of a blackguard forced against my will and in danger of my own life. That I was too ignorant to know how to act, and that to hang me would be judicial murder. That I am well and decently dressed, that I robbed a dead woman to appear so. That I am of a sullen disposition with a quarrelsome temper. That I have the appearance of a person rather above my humble station. That I am a good girl with a pliable nature, and no harm is told of me. That I am cunning and devious. That I am soft in the head and little better than an idiot. And I wonder, how can I be all these different things at once?
Alias Grace is a 2017 show adapted from Margaret Atwood's 1997 novel of the same name. For the sake of my argument, I will only be focusing on some aspects of the show and may not mention all events or characters in this video. Thomas, a wealthy Scottish bachelor, is having an affair with Nancy, his housekeeper. Keeping in mind this is 1996 when such behavior is completely unacceptable. Their neighbors have caught wind of the affair and disapproval is growing. In an attempt to quell the rumors, Nancy hires a female servant named Grace Marks. Along with Grace, another servant, James, has already been working in the household for some time. Less than a month later, Thomas and Nancy are found murdered. The obvious suspects are Grace and James. While James is hanged, Grace claims she has no memory of the day of the murder and is sentenced to life imprisonment because her involvement in the murders remains unclear. 15 years have passed since the murders. As with all notorious cases, opinions are divided. Some believe Grace is guilty, while others see her as innocent. Those who believe in her innocence have formed a committee in hopes of securing her pardon and release. To this end, Dr. Simon, a psychiatrist, is tasked with determining whether Grace is mentally ill and therefore not responsible for her actions. Through these interviews, we find out that Grace has been a constant victim throughout her life of the schemes and machinations of the men around her. Grace endured a deeply troubled childhood, spending most of her early years caring for her siblings after her mother passed away. Her father was an abusive man who drank away all his earnings, leaving the children with nothing to eat. The situation was so bad that at one point he even tried to assault Grace. To make ends meet, Grace had no choice but to leave home and find work. Even there, she is victimized by the men she works for, who view her solely through a lustful lens, reducing her role to that of mere appeasement. One of these men, George, robs Grace of her one and only true friend, Mary Whitney, by impregnating her under the false promise of marriage. Tragically, Mary dies in a failed abortion. George then seeks to make Grace his next victim, forcing her to seek new employment as a way to escape. She is then victimized by her new employer, Thomas, whose subtle attentions towards her ignite jealousy in Nancy. This leads Nancy to make life increasingly difficult for Grace, eventually threatening to dismiss her without a reference, effectively stripping Grace of her only means of supporting herself. She is frequently harassed by her fellow servant, James, who lusts after her and incorporates her into his own scheme to murder Thomas and Nancy, though she does not want to be a part of it. She is even victimized by her lawyer, who for some reason believes that Grace is interested in him. Then there is Jamie, a man who falsely testifies against Grace in court out of spite after she rejects his marriage proposal. Grace's whole life has been a series of misfortunes, and one way or another it has always been the men in her life that were responsible for making it so. Having said that, let's address the elephant in the room. Was Grace actually guilty of the murders? Well, yes and no. In the finale, Grace is put under hypnosis by Dr. Jerome, where it is revealed that she did in fact murder Nancy and Thomas, except she was not Grace when she did it. She was Mary Whitney, her deceased friend and the only true friend she ever had. This suggests that Grace might have been suffering from multiple personality disorder, which explains why she had no memory of the murders. However, this is not the full story. Dr. Jerome is actually a peddler who once went by the name of Jeremiah and had known Grace long before she started working in the Thomas household. This means Jeremiah's whole Dr. Jerome identity is an act. raising the possibility that he and Grace fabricated the Mary Whitney hypnosis performance together. How do we know they did not concoct the whole story to suggest Grace's innocence? How do we know what's true and what's not? As viewers, we are left puzzled, wondering what actually happened on the day of the murders because there is no clear resolution to the story. But asking whether Grace is guilty or not is the wrong question. The real question is why? What brought her to the point where she became an unreliable narrator, where she felt the need to weave a different truth for everyone she met because her actual truth was always questioned, judged, and at times even shunned? The ancient Greeks believed that women's health problems were caused by their uterus moving around their bodies. This belief was based on the Greek word for uterus, which is hysteria. John Martin Charcot, a prominent 19th century French neurologist, redefined hysteria as a mental rather than physical condition, suggesting that it stemmed from a woman's disturbed mind. Working at the Salpêtre Hospital in Paris, Charcot added another aspect to the hysteria narrative. He linked hysteria with madness, which he emphasized by publicly displaying women. Charcot turned these women into spectacles, particularly for his male students. He often photographed them during hypnosis, presenting them as objects of visual and erotic fascination. As Laura Mulvey later noted, these women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact so that they can be said to connote to be looked atness. Charcot and his students were more interested in the spectacle of madness and their control over these women than in understanding the woman's true experiences. By the mid 1880s, Freud, Brewer, and Janet had realized that hysterical symptoms could be alleviated when the traumatic memories as well as the intense feelings that accompanied them were recovered and put into words. Brewer's patient Anna O famously referred to this practice as the talking cure. Later, Freud posited that hysteria stemmed not from actual traumatic events but from an inherent human sexual disposition. The young, pretty, mad, hysterical woman that Charcot had showcased became, in Freud's reformulation, a liar whose story could not be trusted. She was seen as unconsciously desiring the very things that traumatized her. Although Janet, Freud, and Brewer initially aimed to take women's traumatic realities seriously, their work ultimately laid the foundation for a psychological theory of the next century whose basis was in the denial of women's reality. This dynamic is vividly reflected in the life story of Grace Marks. Like the woman in Charcot's displays, Grace is treated as a spectacle, something to be observed and analyzed rather than understood. The men around her hear her words but fail to truly listen to her truth. They are more interested in studying her as a specimen than in empathizing with her experiences. Just as Charcot's patients were reduced to objects for the male gaze, Grace is reduced to a subject of scrutiny, with her reality ignored and her humanity overlooked. In their 1991 work, Shoshana Feldman and Dory Loeb challenged the Freudian belief that language can fully capture traumatizing experiences or complex emotions. They note that while there is in each survivor an imperative need to tell, there is also the recognition that there are never enough words or the right words. There's never enough time or the right time, and never enough listening or the right listening to articulate the story that cannot be fully captured in thought, memory, and speech. This tension leaves survivors and witnesses of trauma struggling to produce testimony, while the rest of the world struggles to truly hear and understand the reality of their experiences. Grace Marks' story exemplifies this struggle. Her version of events is manipulated by her lawyer, twisted by the sensationalist press, ignored by asylum doctors, and distorted by her own efforts to amuse, protect, or perhaps seek revenge on a world that has subjected her to the worst of what men in power have to offer. Grace is repeatedly written in and out of her own narrative, shrouded by rumors, fear, and lust, and turned inside out by grief. The question remains, is Grace truly guilty, or are we the ones to blame for pushing her to the limits where she felt compelled to create an alias? Can anything real remain amidst such distortion?